So you learned the basics of HTML in the last section, and so now it's time to learn the basics of the second language of the web, and that is CSS. Now, CSS is essentially all about styling the content that we write in HTML. And so in this section, we will keep building our project and basically add some visual styles to it. We will also learn some theoretical concepts that are behind CSS so that you actually understand how CSS works. And this is really important because then once you start writing your own code, you will actually know what you're doing. So I hope all that sounds really exciting, and so let's get started. Welcome to the first lecture about CSS. So just like we did in the HTML fundamentals section, in this section we will also start by looking at what CSS actually is, and we will learn some common terminology so that you always know what I'm talking about when I refer to different pieces of the CSS code. So, first of all, CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And just like HTML, CSS is also one of the core technologies of the web. Now, remember that we use HTML to basically describe the content of a page. And on the other hand, we use CSS to describe the visual style and the presentation of the content that we previously wrote using HTML. So CSS and HTML work very closely together. And in fact, down here, you can see a web page, which is actually the project that we will build later in the course. So in the left side, you have just the content, so just the HTML. And then on the right side, you have the exact same HTML code, but with a lot of CSS. And so that CSS describes the visual style and also the layout, basically, of that whole content. Now, as you already know, HTML consists of a bunch of different elements that we can use to describe the content. And so, again, CSS is similar to that, because CSS consists of countless properties that we developers can then use to format the content. And these properties allow us to format different things about the font, the text, the general spacing, the layout of the page, and so on and so forth. There is really lots of different properties, and of course you don't need to know all of them by heart. There's just no need for that. The way that you learn these properties is that you use the most important ones over and over again, and at one point it will then become very intuitive. Okay, so this is what CSS is all about. So let's now take a look at an actual piece of CSS code. So this is what a typical small piece of CSS might look like. And it always starts with a selector. So for example, if we want to style all the H1 elements on the page, we need to select it in CSS, and then we can apply some styles to it. And so each of these styles, we can call it a declaration. So for example, here we set the font size to 20 pixels. And so that font size is called the property, and the 20 pixels is the value that we declare for that font size property. And so property and value together is a declaration. And we can also more casually call that a style. Then all of these declarations or styles together make up the declaration block. So we have these curly braces after the selector, and so inside of the declaration block go all the different declarations, so all our styles. And all this together, so basically the selector plus the declaration block, is what we call a CSS rule. And so what this means is that in the end, our CSS code will be a lot of different CSS rules, one after another, where we select all of our elements and style them in any way that we want. Okay, and so that is exactly what we will start doing in the next video. So let's go there right now. There are three places where we can write CSS, and we call them inline CSS, internal CSS, and external CSS. And so let's now learn about these three different types of CSS and also which one is the best. And in this section and also the next one, we will actually keep working on this same project that we started building in the last section. So the section about the introduction to HTML. And remember that this is how we left the project after that last section. And now by the end of this first CSS section, it will look like this. So that's completely different, right? So we have a lot of colors here. We have this color border at the top. The font is also completely different. So the text color also changed. And yeah, here we have some nice background colors. We even have this button here floating here on the right side. And so, yeah, a lot of visual styles are going to be applied through the page throughout this section. And you will learn a lot of CSS by building this project. Okay. Now, I like to keep one folder for each of these sections. And so I will now go to my desktop and create a brand new project folder for this section. So what I'm going to do is this time I will not go into this folder, which is the code that we downloaded from GitHub. But instead, what I will do is to simply copy this project from the last section. Okay. And then I will call it 03 and CSS fundamentals. And so the starting point for this section is the final code of the last section. So I hope that makes sense. But if you feel like just working in the same folder, that is of course absolutely no problem. So you can just keep writing code exactly in the same documents that we have been working on in the last section. I'm just doing it like this so that in the end I can give you all the code organized nicely. Okay, so I will now close this window here. And we can right click, for example, here on VS Code and say new window, and then open the folder from here. So on the desktop, it is this that I just created. Open it. And then as always, I'm pushing it to the left side. Now, yeah, we can put this here on the other side, but later we will need a little bit more space because you see that there was some space here before, right? And so with this layout just being on the right side, there is not enough for that. But for now, that doesn't really matter. Now this one that we had before, now since we closed that window, it will no longer work. So if I reload here now, Google Chrome tells me that this site can't be reached. So I can just close this and I can then click again here on Go Live now in this new window. Okay, so in this new project, which is actually the same, but it is a new project folder. And so for VS Code, it is like a new project. So if I click now on Go Live, it should start again. And so here is the way we left the project after the last section, which is the starting point of this new one. Great. But now let's finally get started with some CSS, right? So remember, there were three ways of writing CSS, and the first one was inline CSS. So let me start by showing you how inline CSS works. And inline CSS is basically just writing the CSS code inside, essentially, of the element. So let's say that we wanted to style this text here blue, so this H1. We could declare the style attribute like this, and then inside of this HTML element and inside of this HTML file, we would then start writing our CSS. So we can say color and then set it to blue. If I give it a save, then you see that it turned actually blue. So this worked, right? However, inline styles should usually never be used. Okay, I'm just showing this to you so that if in some case you see this here on some other code and some other web page, then you know what it is. But you should not use it when you code on your own. So when you build your own web pages or websites, then don't do this, okay? And so let's now move on to the second way of writing CSS, which is called internal CSS. So with internal CSS, we come here to the head, and then we declare a style element. So style, and then we can write our CSS right here into this style element. So basically this entire page is HTML, but everything that is inside this style element that needs to be inside of the head will be CSS. And so now let's write something very similar to what we wrote by the end of the last video. So remember that we always need to start with a selector, because in this case we are not going to write the code directly on the H1 element. And so our CSS needs a way of knowing what element we actually want to style, right? So we can select it like this, and then we start our declaration block. And again, that is what we talked about by the end of the last lecture. And so now here we can write a style. So a declaration, which is just a property, in this case the color property, and then we specify the blue value for it. And if we now save it and reload, then you see that once again the code turned blue here. So this entire text just became blue. Great. So this is already a huge step forward, because now we decoupled the style, which is all of this here, from the actual HTML element. So before, as we had the style here, then the CSS and the HTML were kind of entangled. And that is never a good thing in programming. And so we want to keep these things in separate places. We also call it the separation of concerns. And so now we have our style here, so everything up in the head, and the elements down here separated. However, if we have a lot of CSS code, then that is also not really practical. So imagine we have like 500 lines of CSS code, and that is actually not uncommon. And so in that case, that would bloat our HTML file, and it would be very hard to navigate it. And so therefore, we can separate things even more by putting all of our CSS code into a special CSS file. So let's do that. So we click here again on New File, and this one here can have any name, but I like to call it style.css. Okay, so in HTML, the first page should usually always be called index.html. That's really a convention. But for the CSS file, you can give it any name that you want. But again, I like to call it style.css. Okay, and so this is what we now call external CSS, because we will move now this declaration block, or this rule actually, into a completely different file. And so this CSS is now external to the HTML. Okay, so we have our style here, and now we no longer need the style in here. Now, maybe you noticed that as I saved this, the blue color is actually gone. So why do you think that is happening? So why is this text no longer blue, even though we have the exact same code here as we had before? Well, the reason is that HTML right now has no way of knowing that we actually do have a CSS file. Or in other words, the HTML file and the CSS file do not automatically get linked. So what we need to do is to tell our HTML file that there is a CSS file that we want to use to style the HTML. So we need to link them together, basically. And we do that once again here in the HTML head, because that is exactly where all the information about the page goes. And for that, we use the link element. So that's yet another new element. And the link element is actually quite confusing for beginners, because many people, when they start out, might think that the link element is actually to create hyperlinks like here. But that is of course not the case. So as you know already, to create hyperlinks, we use the anchor tag, so not the link tag. So the link element really only has the only purpose of connecting the HTML to a CSS file. So here we specify href once again. And then here we need the path to the CSS file. And so in that case, this is just style.css. Then here it is also good to specify the rel property and tell the HTML ahead of time that this is a style sheet. And now when I save this again, watch what happens. And nice, our text here is blue again. And so now we successfully connected our CSS file right here to our HTML file. So this is now external CSS, and it is what we will use throughout the rest of the course. And it's also what I advise you to do for whenever you build your own web pages. However, internal CSS also sometimes has its place, especially when you just want to build something small and fast and want to do everything in the same file. Then it is perfectly acceptable to create internal CSS using the style element, remember? So just like this. But inline CSS, which is what I showed you in the very beginning, so adding the style right here using the style attribute, that is usually not a good practice. And so it's not a good idea to do that. All right, and with this now in place, we are ready to start learning our very first couple of CSS properties for styling text. And so that is going to be the subject of our next lecture. In this lecture, we will learn about 6 properties to style text with CSS. And let's just quickly recap what we did in the last lecture. So we are writing external CSS in this CSS file, and the CSS file is always composed of multiple CSS rules. So right now we only have one CSS rule, but of course we will now start adding more of them. Now a CSS rule always starts with a selector. So in this case, we are selecting the h1 element. But if there were more h1 elements, then the selector would actually select all of them. Then we have this declaration block here, into which we can write one or more declarations like this one. And each declaration has this property name, so in this case the color, and then the value that we specify for that property, which in this case is this keyword of blue. Okay, and so now we will start adding some more properties here. And the first one that I want to use is the font size. So here we can basically specify the size of the text. And each property can take different types of values, such as length or keywords. So you see that here in the color, the value is a keyword. But now here in the font size, we actually need a length. So basically the size of the text in this case. Now we can specify length using different units in CSS, but don't worry about that for now. So for now, we will simply use the very simplest one, which is pixels on your screen. So we can specify the font size, for example, to 26 pixels, then add a semicolon here. And so now the text on the screen will be exactly 26 pixels of your physical screen. So if I give this a save now, then you see that the text here decreased. And just remember that in case it didn't update on your computer and you are successfully connected to the live server, as you can see down here, then just manually reload the page here once, and then in the successful updates here of the code, it will then automatically reload your page. But anyway, let's now start adding the next property, which is the font family. And so here you can specify basically different fonts for your text. So just like you can specify a font in something like a Word document or a Google Page document, you can do the same in CSS. However, what's different in the case of CSS is that you cannot simply use a font family that you have installed on your computer, because that wouldn't then work for all the users that are going to visit your page in the future unless they also have that font installed on the computer, right? So there is a solution for that we will talk about later, but for now we will simply not actually specify a real font family, but instead just use the keyword that we want the browser to use any font size that is a sans serif. And sans serif, we will also learn a little bit later what that actually means, so in the design section of this course. But if we give this now a save, you see that this font here changed completely, right? So now it looks more clean, but what matters is that now as we update our page, in fact, the font family here of this heading now looks very different, right? So it no longer has these serifs, which are like these small things here at the end of the letters. And again, later in the design section, we will then learn how we can specify specific font families for our pages. But now let's take a look at our next property here for text, which is text transform. And so with text transform, we can basically turn a text uppercase. So you can see one more time that VS Code gives us a lot of suggestions here. So this whole list, and so the most used one here is actually uppercase. So uppercase like this, and the result is exactly what you would expect. So all the text simply turned uppercase. So this is a simple one. And now let's try another one, which is called font style. And here again, you see these options, and the most used one in this case is to set some text to italic. So let's check that out. And indeed, that is just what happened. So the text turned italic as expected. Great. So we already covered 4 properties and some of its possible values here. So we're making good progress. And of course, as I mentioned before, you do not have to start memorizing these properties here now. You will get used to them over time as you start using them more and more. And let's actually get rid of this one here, because we will actually talk about colors a little bit later. Okay, so let's now go to our next headings. So let's now style our H2 element. So that is this basically main heading of this article. And so we can use the properties that we already learned. And so if you keep typing these property names, they will start getting into your brain. So this one, let's actually make it even bigger than the H1. So really big, like 40 pixels. And that's no problem at all. So just because the H1 is the main heading of the page, it doesn't mean that it also needs to be the biggest one. So being the H1 is really all about semantics, not only about what it looks like. So we have a nice big text, and now let's just make it also a sans serif. So giving it this modern look and feel. So the sans serif keyword. And here we go. Next up, let's style our paragraphs. And so as I mentioned before, by selecting the P element like this, this will actually select all the P elements that are on our page. So this paragraph here, and this, and really all the ones that we have here on the page. Okay. So let's give it again a font size, let's say of 22 pixels. And for now, all of these length here, so all of these numbers that I've been using are kind of random. But later we will also learn how we can use a system so that we can basically automatically figure out which font sizes we should use. Okay, now I also want to change the font family again. And once again, using sans serif. And nice. That looks very nice already. And if we compare it with our demo, then we can see that we start getting closer to our demo page. So what we want to achieve in the end. There is actually just one more thing that I want to change here in the paragraphs, which is to specify yet another new property, which is the line height. So I will first actually specify it, and then you will see the difference in the text. So here we actually use a value without a unit. So in this case, this 1.5 simply means that the line height will be 1.5 times the font size. All right, so by default, the line height is simply 1. But now if we set it to 1.5, then you should see the space between the lines here increase. So between here and here and here. So look closely at that as I now click here to reload the page. And you see that really changed. Right, and we could set it even higher, of course, and then we would get even more space, but that looks already a bit too much. So let's go back to 1.5 like this. Now, by the way, something quite interesting happened here that maybe you noticed. So remember how inside of these paragraphs that we just styled, we have different elements such as this italic text, which is an EM element, remember? So here in this paragraph, for example, we have the EM element, or here in this paragraph, we have the strong element, right? Or down here we have the anchor. So this element right here. And as you can see, these elements here on the page, so for example, this anchor here somehow got the same font size and the same font family as the P element, even though we did not specify these styles for the link anywhere. So we didn't specify the font size and the family and the line height, not for the anchor, not for strong text, or not for strong elements, and also not for the EM element, right? But still, they got these styles applied to them somehow, right? And the reason for this is a very important mechanism called inheritance. Now, this is a little bit complex to understand, and so we will have a whole lecture on inheritance a little bit later. But still, I wanted to already show you this effect in action here at this point. But anyway, let's now keep styling or reminding elements. So starting with H3, and let's put that here after the H2 to group our rules here in a logical way. So the font size in this one, let's make it like 30 pixels. So that's going to be this one here, exactly, and this one. So again, we have multiple H3 elements, and so by using the H3 selector here, we will select all of them. Now just the font family again, and setting it to sans serif. All right, and now finally we have the H4 heading. So that's this one here. So let's again set the font size and the font family. So 20 pixels. And here's sans serif. And actually, let's also turn the text uppercase here. So, and remember how we use the text transform property for that. We set it to uppercase like this. Nice. And now there is just one final property that I want to show you to basically style text, which is that we can also align text. So again, a little bit like we can do in Microsoft Word or in Google Pages or something like that. And so for that, we use the text align property. And again, you can see the options here. So one interesting one that we can use is to align the text to the center. And so guess what will happen now when I save it? Well, we need to go down here again. And you see that now it is in the center of the page. And technically it is in the center of its parent element, but that parent element basically occupies this entire page. And so therefore it is now at the center of the page. All right. And so now the only thing that we are missing is these list items here. So all of these 5 and these 3, and also these anchors. So the links. But we will style the links a little bit later because there are some special cases for links. So let's just finish this video by styling these li elements. All right. Let's do that down here. And notice how we do not style the OL element and the UL element that are the parent elements of the list items. Okay. So remember that the list itself is an OL or it is a UL, but we do actually style the LI elements. Okay, and so again, let's set the font family to something. So to sans serif, actually. Give it a save. And we also want to change the font size one more time. So by default, we get this font size that we see here, which is usually 16 pixels by default. Okay, so that's an important thing that we also need to know a little bit later. So take note of that. But of course, we want to make it a little bit bigger. So we have our paragraphs at 22 pixels. So let's actually make this a little bit smaller. So let's say at 20 pixels. And that's it. Beautiful. So we finished the basic styling of our text of our page, and we learned about 6 new CSS properties along the way. So take some time to review what we just did, and then let's move on to the next lecture, where we will learn a little bit more about selectors. Let's now make the CSS code that we just wrote a little bit better by combining some of the selectors. So you might have noticed that we applied the exact same font family to all of our elements here, right? So all these 6 CSS rules that we have here, all of them have font style, or actually have font family set to sans serif, right? And you see that VS Code actually highlights these occurrences here in all of the rules. So doing that is a little bit repetitive, right? And it's also not a good practice, because let's say that all of a sudden we wanted to change the font family to something else. Then we would have to go through all of these different rules and set the font family then to something else there. So instead, what we can do is to create a list of selectors in order to select multiple elements and then apply this font family to that list, essentially. So let me show you how we can do that. And let's do it first here, actually. So what we want to do is to select the H1 element and the H2 element and the H3 element. And so, as you see, the way we write that is by using these commas. Okay. So again, here we are going to select the H1 elements and the H2 elements and the H3 elements and the H4 elements and the P's and also all the LI elements. Okay. And now we can grab this text here and cut it and paste it here. And now we can remove it from all of these other selectors. All right. And if I give it a save now, the page should basically look exactly the same. And it does. Okay, now prettier formatted or CSS code here like this. So having one element for each line. And so this is a bit easier to read. And so now if we wanted to change the font family, let's say to serif, which is actually the default. So if I save this now, then you see that all of the elements changed at once, right? So all of them now have the serif text. Then of course, if we set it back here, then all of them will change, right? So now we have serif text everywhere. Well, actually, except for in the footer. So that's something that we need to fix. And to make it easier here, let's actually simply wrap this text here inside a paragraph. So let's come here to our HTML. So this is really important that you do this. And so create a new element here, and it automatically closed it. So let's just then grab this text and paste it here. And you see that now this paragraph looks just like all the others. Okay, so don't skip this step. Please do this because we will now need it for another example. And in fact, let's look at that example right away. So the size of our paragraphs is 22 pixels. And so of course, now the paragraph that's in the footer, so this one, is also 22 pixels. However, the text that's in the footer is usually a lot smaller than the rest of the text, because this is just some secondary information that is not really important. And so therefore, we should actually make this text in this paragraph here smaller than the text in the other paragraphs. And one way in which we can do this is to combine selectors in another way. So just to recap, here we combined these 6 selectors into one list. So we say that the selector here is now a list selector. So this here is still one selector, but it is a list selector. Okay, so this is one way of combining selectors, but now I will give you another way of combining selectors. And the goal of that is, as we just discussed, to decrease the font size in here. So we will now use the so-called descendant selector, which is to write something like this. So we select the footer element, then a space, and then the P selector. And so what this will do is it will select all the P elements that are inside of footer elements. And so that's why this is called the descendant selector, because the P element is a child element of the footer in our HTML. And so therefore, this selector here will then select all of these paragraphs that are children of footer elements. And so if we now set the font size here to something smaller, let's say 16 pixels, then you see that all the other P's, they are still normal, but in fact, this paragraph that is inside the footer is now only 16 pixels small. And hopefully you can see how useful the descendant selector like this here is. So actually use this all the time. However, in this case, this actually isn't very robust, because like this, the selector basically reflects the HTML structure, which can lead to problems. And to show that to you, let's write another descendant selector. So in this case, let's say that we want to select this paragraph here that's inside of the header. So remember that we have a header here in the article. So this one here, and we have a P. So let's say we wanted to style that italic. So make the text italic. And so using what we just learned, we could say header, and then the P that is inside there, and then say font style and set it to italic. Okay, so this worked just fine, But now imagine that for some reason we also added a paragraph to this header element that is up here in the page. So let's try that. And remember that here we have another header, right? So as I was just saying, let's add a P here, test paragraph. And you see that this one is now also italic. However, what we wanted was only this paragraph here to be italic and not this one, right? So we need to solve this somehow, and actually we can solve it. It is not too hard. Well, at least in this case, because this header here is inside of the article and this one is not, right? And so we can actually create a nested descendant selector. So we can have a descendant inside a descendant. So what I mean is basically writing this. So we only want the paragraphs that are inside of headers, which are inside of articles, to be italic. So let's give it a save. And now only this one is italic and this one here not anymore. So this actually works, but we are now even more encoding the HTML structure into our CSS selectors. And that can make our code hard to maintain in the future if we ever change our HTML. And so that's not a good idea. So if we think about this, wouldn't it actually be a lot better if we had a way to basically give some elements names and then use these names to select them? Well, we actually can do that, and it is exactly the subject of the next lecture. So let's go there right now. At the end of the previous lecture, we discussed how it would be nice to be able to name some elements and then use those names to select them in CSS. And so in this video, we will learn to do exactly that using classes and IDs. So remember how in the last lecture, we wanted to style only this text here as italic, so this paragraph that is inside this header, but not this other paragraph that is also inside of a header. So we came up with the solution of selecting only the paragraphs inside of headers that are inside of articles. Remember that? The problem with this is that this essentially encodes the HTML structure into our CSS selector, and that is not a good idea. And so instead, we will now basically name this element here with something called an ID, and so with that, we can then avoid writing a big and a long selector like this. So let's go here, and the paragraph in question is this one here. And so now we can specify a special attribute called an ID. So the attribute is called ID, and now let's simply call this one author. So remember this name here, author. And so now this element here, this paragraph, is basically called author. And so now in our CSS, we can use the hash selector. So this one, which is in fact the ID selector. So hash, and now the name of the ID that we just specified. And now here we can one more time set the font style to italic. All right. And now we can get rid of this code here because it's no longer necessary. Now, instead of deleting this code, I actually want to keep it here. And so we can do something similar as we did in HTML, where we wrote comments. Remember that? So here we wrote some HTML comments to keep this code here without being actually active, right? And so in HTML, we can do the same. It just works in a different way. So in CSS, we write the slash, then the star, and then from this place on, everything else will be a comment. So we need to close this comment because, of course, we want this code to be active. And so we write now the opposite. So star and slash. So now only this is gray, and so only this is a comment. So if I save this now, then you see that in fact, only this text, so only this paragraph is italic and not this one. Let's actually add another style here, so another declaration, and let's set the font size to 18 pixels. So make it a bit smaller, because remember how the other paragraphs are 22 pixels big. And indeed, this one here got smaller, and all the other paragraphs, including of course this one here, stayed the same. Now let's do something similar to the copyright text here. So this one, and with that we will then replace this CSS rule right here. So we can again comment it out the way I just did it, but let me actually show you a nice VS Code trick. So in order to comment a code that you previously selected like this, all you have to do is to hit Command or Control/. So I will do that now. And so you see that it automatically added these comments here, right? And if I then hit Command or Control on Windows +/ again, then it turns the comment back off. So I can go back and forth between these two modes. So if we reload this now, of course, it will be back to 22 pixels. And so let's go to our HTML and give this one a name. So a name using the ID attribute. So ID, let's say copyright. Let's then select this text, copy it, and just paste it here. And remember, we use the ID selector like this, plus the name that we just specified. And let's go back to a font size of 16 pixels. And here it is. So it worked once again. Now, besides the ID, there's actually another way of giving elements names, which is by using the class instead of an ID. So we specified the ID attribute here to give this element a name, but we could also have used the class attribute. Now, the big difference between IDs and classes is that we are not allowed to repeat ID names. Or in other words, we can only use each ID name only once. So it would not be allowed to now add an ID of copyright to something else. So I could not, for example, now go here and add the ID of copyright. So this would actually be invalid HTML. So we are not allowed to do that. And so if we need to reuse a name multiple times, then we need to use classes for that. Okay, so let me show you an example of using classes. And so what I want to do now is to style these authors here of these 3 related posts in a different way. So basically that's this P element here, and this one, and this one. And so again, I can now not use the ID of, say, related author. So instead, I need to use the class attribute, and let's call it related-author. So in CSS, it is a convention that if we have a class or an ID name with multiple words, we separate these words by dashes like this. You could also use underscores, for example, so that's also valid, but it's just a convention in CSS to always use dashes like this. Okay. So anyway, let's now grab this here and paste it to all these paragraphs. So related author 3 times. And so now let's go to our CSS and style all the elements that have this class. So for the IDs, we used the hash to select them, and for classes, we use the dot. So this is the class selector. Okay, so related author, and let's say that here we want the font size to be 18 pixels, let's say. And let's also specify a new text property that we didn't learn before, which is the font weight. So this one we can use to make text bold, for example. So as you saw maybe here, there are multiple options. We can use some numbers, but we will use that later. For now, let's just use a keyword, which is bold. So let's save it to see the results. And indeed, now only these 3 paragraphs are different. So they are bold and they are smaller than all the other paragraphs. So of course, in the HTML, they are still paragraphs, but now they got these additional styles here, right? Now, maybe you are wondering something here now, which is that we are now, in fact, selecting these paragraphs multiple times, right? So we are selecting this paragraph here, in fact, right? But we are also selecting it here, and we are selecting it actually also up here. So 3 times now we selected this paragraph. So you might be thinking which one of these gets applied actually. So isn't this like some kind of conflict? Well, the short answer is that actually all of these selectors do apply. So all of these 3 rules of the 3 selectors do in fact apply. But I will explain more about how all of this works and why it works this way in an extra video, because this is something really important that you will need to understand in order to master CSS. And so this topic deserves a special lecture on itself, which will be a bit later in this section. But now, moving forward here, let me now actually give you a small challenge. So what I want to do is to remove the bullet points of only this list here. So remember that we created a list for this, and so of course this one has bullet points right now. So I want you to select only this list here, only this element, and remove its bullet points. Now we never removed any bullet points, so let me show you how it works. And for that I will now in fact select all the unordered lists. So here we use the property list style and set it to the keyword of none. Okay. So the bullet points disappeared from this one, but also from this one. And so, as I said, I want you to now select only this element here and then remove the bullet points in there. And I want you to do this by using a class called related. Okay. So let me comment this one here. And so, yeah, create a class on this element, on this list here, and then remove the bullet points from this one. And I will see you back here in a minute once you are done. Okay, so let's start by going to the HTML. And then, of course, this here is the UL that we want to select. And remember how I wanted you to use a class, and I will explain a bit later why. So we used a class here called related. And now we go to our CSS and select this element with the class that we just named. So of course using the class selector like this. And now only on this one, we say that the list style should be none. Give it a save. And so this one still has the bullet points and this one doesn't. Great. So we did this because we don't want this list here to actually look like a list. It should only semantically be a list of related posts. But anyway, let's now go back to our HTML and talk a little bit about why we used a class and not an ID. Because in fact, there's only one list element of related posts, right? So we could easily have called this an ID, right? Because remember that the IDs are for names that are only used once, while classes are used when we want to give multiple elements the same name. So when we want to style multiple elements the same way in CSS. So knowing about that, why did I tell you to use a class and not an ID? Well, the reason for that is that usually in the real world, we never use IDs. We always use classes because by using classes, we are prepared for the future. So imagine that we used, in fact, an ID of related, but then at some point later, somewhere on the page, we wanted to add another list of related posts. Maybe we wanted one in the sidebar and we wanted one in the footer. So imagining a more complex layout. That would completely be possible, right? But then if we had used an ID of related in the beginning, we would now have to go back and change that ID to a class so that we could now add another list of related posts. And so that would be a source of error if we, for some reason, forgot that. And we would also have to go to our CSS and change that there. So if first it was an ID of related, we would now have to come back here and change it to a dot, so to the class selector. And while this doesn't seem to be a big problem, it can actually lead to bugs, so to errors in the code if we have a really big project. And so by default, we simply avoid this potential problem by simply always using classes. Okay? Now I will still keep this ID here for you. So this ID of copyright and this ID of author, just so you also know how to work with IDs. But in the future, I will actually no longer use IDs because, as I just said, in the real world, we simply always use classes, even if we only use the class name once. Because by doing that, we are making our code ready for the future and ready for potential changes. Okay? So I hope that made sense. And you can now go ahead if you want and name some more elements and style them in different ways if you feel like it. So basically to practice this a little bit. And then if you'd like, you can come with me to the next video where we will start working with colors. Welcome back. In this lecture, we will learn how to work with colors in CSS. However, before we can actually go back to our CSS, we first need to learn a little bit about the theory of how to represent colors using code. Now, there are many ways of representing colors in computers and basically in writing code, but one of the more traditional models is the RGB model. So in the RGB model, every single color can be represented by any combination of red, green, and blue colors. So that looks something like this. And maybe you have already seen a diagram like this somewhere in school or something like that. So anyway, in order to actually represent a certain color, we need to give each of the three base colors any value between 0 and 255. And so with that, we can define a total of 16.8 million different colors. So let's understand this a little bit using our diagram here. And starting with the pure red color, of course, in this channel, red is at the complete maximum, which is 255, and the other two channels, so the other two base colors, are at 0. So there's no green whatsoever and no blue whatsoever. And so this is why this is pure red. So again, the red channel is at the maximum value and all the other ones are at 0. And the same, of course, for blue and for green. So in blue, the blue channel is at the maximum of 255 and the other ones at 0. And in green, basically the same happens for green. Next up, we have white. And in white, we have all the three colors at the maximum of 255. So basically having all the colors at maximum gives us a complete white, while at the other end of the spectrum, when we have all the colors at 0, we get a complete black color. Finally, the other three colors that we have here are a mix of the other two colors that they are made of. So you see that this magenta here is red and blue at the maximum and no green at all. Then we have this, I think is called cyan or cyan color, which has red at 0 and G and B at its maximum. And finally, yellow has blue at 0 and the other two at 255. Great. So I hope that this makes sense. And now that we have a very basic understanding of how the RGB model works, let's actually see how we can represent or how we can define colors in CSS. So in CSS, we have two ways of writing colors using the RGB model. And those are the RGB notation and the hexadecimal notation. So by using the RGB notation, all we do is to use this RGB function in CSS, and then we simply specify the values for each of the three color channels, red, green, and blue. So for example, if we set green and blue to the maximum values, then we get this cyan color, just as we saw in the last slide. Another example, which is a lot more real world, is this orange color right here. So here the numbers for each channel look a little bit more random. And so this is how we get a real looking color using CSS and using the RGB notation. Then, besides the normal RGB function, there is also RGB with transparency. And transparency is also called alpha, and so that's why this function is called RGBA. So here we can specify a fourth value, which in this case is this 0.3, and this will then give this color a transparency, as we can see here. Looking at this other example, if we, for example, define an alpha value of 0.7, then we see that this color is actually transparent as visible when we put it on top of another color like this green square. Now, of course, we don't have to manually come up with these numbers for these colors, okay? So we don't have to manually write 244, 179, 63 in order to get this orange. So usually we just copy a certain color from somewhere, or we can also generate it with a color picker in VS Code. And so that will then automatically give us these numbers. But all this is still very important so that you know what these numbers actually mean. Okay, but moving on, let's now talk about the hexadecimal notation, which is actually a bit more used in CSS. So here in the hexadecimal notation, we don't use a scale from 0 to 255, but instead we use a scale from 0 to FF. And FF is basically the same as 255, but in a hexadecimal scale. And we don't need to go into what that actually means, but basically hexadecimal numbers do not go from 0 to 9, but from 0 to 15. So there are 16 different numbers and not just 10. And the last one is the F. And so that's why FF here means 255. Now, translating that to CSS, we write hexadecimal notation like this, with the hash, then the value for red, green, and blue, just as I have it here on the screen. And so this then gives us, of course, the exact same number as with the RGB notation. And the same can, of course, be done with this orange example color that I have down here. So we can represent this using F4B33F. And again, this looks kind of random, and so we usually just copy this from the color picker in VS Code. Now, in hexadecimal notation, there's also something called the shorthand, which we can use when all the colors are identical pairs. So in our cyan color here, we have 2 zeros, 2 Fs, and again 2 Fs. And so we can abbreviate that into our shorthand, writing 0FF. All right. And now a little bit about how we actually do things in practice in the real world. So in practice, we mostly use the hexadecimal notation. And then if we need transparency, we use the RGBA function. So as you see here on the left side with the alpha value. Finally, just something about grays, which are a special kind of color that we need all the time in CSS. So basically, in the RGB model, when the three colors in the three channels are exactly the same, what we get is a gray color. So at both extremes of the spectrum, when all of the values are 0, we get complete black, and when all of them are at maximum, so at 205 or at FF, then we get white. But of course, there are many other gray colors in between that we can use. And to be precise, there are exactly 256 pure grays to choose from. And one of them is this one, for example. So where red, green, and blue are all at 69. So this gives us this nice gray color, which has the hexadecimal code of 444444, which in the shorthand notation can be written as just 444. So this one I like to use a lot for text color. And of course, let's take a look at another example. And this one has all the values at 183, and it can be represented as B7, B7, B7. So in the hexadecimal notation, you will see once again that the three pairs here are exactly the same. And so this is the signal that we have, in fact, a gray color. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about the theory of color in code, and in CSS code in particular, let's now quickly learn a couple of CSS properties where we can actually use colors in practice. And the most simple CSS property that requires a color value is simply the color property, which we actually already used before. So let's say that we want this H1 here to have a different color. So let's say color, and then I will just specify some blue color here. 10, 98, and AD. And so this gives us this nice blue color. So as we just learned, we have 10 or 10 in the red channel, 98 in the green channel, and AD in the blue channel. Now, as I mentioned before, we usually use the VS Code color picker. So we get that by simply hovering over a color, and then from here we can choose like any color that we want. Right? So we can change the color here to something else. So this shade of gray, and then in there we can basically define how dark that gray should be. Also, if we click here at the top, so in this value here, that will change the notation. So now we have this HSL, which we actually didn't talk about. But then if we click again, we got the RGB. And so this is exactly the same color as before, but using the RGB function, right? So let me save it. And now you see that we have this green color. So if we hover it again, we get back to the color picker. And now this one here is actually the slider for the alpha value. So if we start dragging it down, then you see that automatically it gets changed to RGBA. Okay. And then here we can, as I mentioned, define the alpha value. So it actually already got saved. And you see that now the color is kind of transparent, right? And if we push it even down close to 0, then now it's almost completely faded out. All right. So this is how we work with the color picker. But now let's actually go back to the color that we had. So 1098 AD. All right. Actually, another nice trick that I wanted to show you. So if you just want the color picker, you can just specify any color first. For example, white by using FFF. And then you just hover the color and then you get to the color picker. All right. So if you wanted, for example, this pink, you can choose that here, maybe with some alpha. And there you go. And now it applied this pink color, because when we have two same definitions, it will simply use the last one. But again, more about that a bit later. So let's get rid of that. And now we actually also want the H2 and the H3 with the exact same color. So this one and this one. So how should we do that? Should we simply copy this property here, so this declaration, and then paste it here and here? Well, not really, right? Because then we would have the exact same code in multiple places. And that is never a good idea, because imagine that then we wanted to change the color, for example, to orange. Then we would have to go through all the 3 color definitions and change them there. So change them one by one. And of course, that's not what we want. So instead, we can define a list of selectors just like we did here. But now only with the ones that we want the blue color to apply to. So that's H1, H2, H3. And now let's simply grab that and paste it here, give it a save, and there you go. So now the H1, H2, and H3 have this blue color. And now, as you also might have noticed one more time, we have now yet another selector that is applying to the H1. So we have this one, and this one, and this one. And in fact, all the styles of all of them are now applying to this element. Next up, let's also define a color for the rest of the text. So right now, the rest of the text is completely black, but let's use that gray color that I showed you in one of the slides. And actually, let's do that here. So we want this text to apply to everything, basically, even these here, and the color will then get overwritten later. And again, we will learn about why and how that works in a separate lecture. So remember, for a gray color, it needs to have the same values in all 3 channels. And so let's say 44, 44, 44, like this. And if you remember the shorthand, then we can abbreviate this even more, because each of the pairs is the same value. It's always just 44. And so we can make this even shorter, just like this. Give it a save. And now indeed, all of this text here is this gray color, except for the H1, 2, and 3, which are overwritten here a little bit later. Great. So let's now talk about another CSS property that can accept a color value, and that is the background color property. So let's now give our main page header a slight gray background color to distinguish it a bit from the rest of the content. So how could we do that? Let's come all the way down here. And the first thing that comes to mind is to simply select header like this, right? And so here is that new property called background color. And here let's use another nice gray color, which is F7, F7, F7. So again, you can see that the colors in the 3 colors, so the 3 main RGB channels, are exactly the same. And by the way, here in the color picker, no matter what color you're in here in this color slider, here on the left, there's always this shade of grays. So if you start here from the top, you see the white that I showed you in the slide, and at the very top, you get then to black. Okay, so you can always get a gray color if you move the slider here at the very extreme of this left side here. But now let's go to F7, F7, which is a color which is nice to memorize and nice to use. So a very subtle gray. Maybe you cannot even see it here, but hopefully you will see it on your screen. Now the problem here is that not only our page header got the gray color, but also this other header. So maybe you could see that coming. And so the solution to that is to give this header a name and then style only this header. Now there's only this one header that we want to style, and so we could use an ID here, but given what I explained in the last lecture, let's not do that, and let's simply use a class. Let's call it main header. Let me copy it and replace this header with the main header class. And indeed, now only this one here got this gray color. Let's just get rid of this test. And here we go. Nice. And if you can't really see this background color, then just use your color picker to just use some other shade of gray. All right. And this video is already running quite long, but let's still talk about another property here, which is about borders. So what I want to do next is to add some border to these related posts here. So basically to make them now look something like this. All right, so we have at the bottom and at the top here, this blue border. So that's not hard to do at all. So let's just see what's the element here. And it is this aside. So let's just select it here using this element selector. So element selector is basically when we simply use the name of the element to select it. Okay, so this here is the class selector with the dot. This is the ID selector with the hash. And when we simply use the name of the element, we call that the element selector. Now let's start by actually giving it the same background color. So background color, and then we use the one that we used before. And VS Code is actually very helpful here because it scans the CSS document for the files that we're already using so that we can very easily use the same ones. And then here, let's now talk about the border. So border, and now this property is actually a special property because it accepts multiple values. So let's define the width of the border as 5 pixels, the style of the border as solid, and then the color of the border as that color that we already used before. So this blue. Okay, let's just give it a save, and then I will explain a little bit more why it works this way. And indeed, here is our blue border. Beautiful. So going back here to this border property, this is actually a special kind of property. So it's called a shorthand property because we can just use one property for defining 3 different properties. So we could also individually style the border width, border style, and border color properties. But usually we do it all in one run and simply define everything at the same time. Now here you can define a lot of different keywords. For example, dotted is always a possibility. So this will look something like this. You can use dashed as well, which will look like this. But usually I never use those. I always go for solid. Okay. So this gives us the entire border around the entire element. However, we only want the border at the top and the bottom. And so instead of defining the border property like this, there are also special variants of this property. So we can also say border top. And so this, as you might expect, will only style the border at the top side of the element. So just like this. Okay, then let's select all of this and paste it here because we also want the border at the bottom. So easy enough, border bottom, give it a save, and here we go. And just for the sake of completeness, we can also say border left and border right. And so then we will be back to square one where we have the borders on all the 4 sides. And so, of course, this doesn't make sense. Then we would simply use the border property. These ones we don't want anyway. And so we are back to this result. All right. And this is how we work with colors in CSS. Now, let me just quickly mention that we can also use these predefined color names just as we did in the very beginning with the color of blue. So quickly show that to you. So let's say that we wanted to set a background color for the entire web page. So that's also possible simply by adding a style to the body. So we can just do background color like this. And here we can specify one of these names. So if I give it a save, then everything has this very beautiful blue color as the background. Except, of course, the elements that we specifically gave another background color, right? Or we could use something else. So usually, if you just start writing some color name, you will get a lot of suggestions here from VS Code, and then you can select one of them like this. Okay, but of course we don't want that, so let's just comment out this code by hitting Command or Control/, and then we are back to normal. Okay, and now just to consolidate this knowledge a little bit, I suggest you to experiment with these 3 properties that we just learned. For example, by adding some borders to some more elements, like some headings or some lists, and also changing some more text colors. And especially important would also be to play around with the color picker a little bit on your own. So just take 10 or 15 minutes to do that, and then I see you in the next video. Let's now learn about something called pseudo classes. Now, pseudo class sounds very strange, but it is actually pretty straightforward. And as an example, let's try to style the first list elements different from the other ones. So we have this list here and this list. And so, as I just said, let's try to style the first element of each of the lists differently. For example, by making them bold. So this element and this element. Now, the straightforward way of doing this would be to add a class to each of them and then style them, right? So let's actually try that first example. So here is one list. So let's add a class of first li, and then let's do the same to the other lists that we have up here. And then back in our CSS, let's select all the elements with the first li class. And then remember, to make text bold, we use font weight set to bold. And indeed, here we are. So now this one is bold and this one, but we can actually do better than this. So instead of doing this manually, we can actually have CSS automatically figure out which is the first li element inside of a container. So let's actually do that. And I will still keep the classes in the HTML just so we keep it as a reference. But now let me show you how we can actually do it better. So we start by using li, which will basically select all the li elements, but then we use a pseudo class. And we start a pseudo class by writing a colon like this, and then the one that we're interested in here is called first dash child. And that's it. And now here we can say font weight and set it to bold. So let's see. And indeed it worked. Now they are back to being bold. So we basically changed our selector here and added a pseudo class to it. And what this first child pseudo class does is that it will select an li element, or actually it will select all the li elements that are the first child elements of its parent elements. And so that is exactly the case right here and right here. Right? So this li element here is the first child element of its parent. So in this case, the ol element. And therefore, this selector that we wrote here will target that element. And the exact same thing is true for this other list down here. Okay, so let's try another one. Again, li. And then we also have one called last child. And here let's make it italic. So font style and set it to italic. And indeed, now the last one became italic. So both here and both here. Because again, both of them are li elements that are now the last child inside of its parent container. Next up, we can actually also target a specific child. So for example, the third or the second child. So for that, we use the nth child pseudo class. And then here we actually need to write parentheses like this, so we can specify which of the childs that we want. So let's say we want the second child to have a color of red. So using just a coded color name here, let's see. And indeed, here it is. Or if we tried the third one, then indeed it would be the third one here and here as well. And even better than that is that we can actually use some keywords here. So we can write odd, and now all the odd elements will be red. So element number 1, number 2, or actually number 3, and here it's element number 1, number 3, and number 5. And if there were more, then it would select number 7, 9, 11, and so on and so forth. And of course, if we can do odd, then we can also do even. So that will then select number 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on and so forth. So you see, number 2, and here 2 and 4, right? So this technique is quite useful, for example, to style tables, which oftentimes have like alternating background colors. So I'm sure you have seen that somewhere. And so it's very helpful for that, this technique here. Now let's actually comment out this property here, because we don't want our text here to be red actually in the final page. All right, so this was just to show you everything that we can do here. Now finally, let me clear up a common misconception that there is around these pseudo classes. So let's say that we wanted to select the first paragraph element that's inside of the article. So let's check that out here in our markup. So inside of the article, the first paragraph would basically be this one here, right? So let's see what we can do here. So what I just said is basically article and then P. So that's the descendant selector, right? So selecting a paragraph that's inside of the article, and now selecting the very first of that. So first child. And now let's say we want the color to be red in this one. But as we reload this and check out our page, you see that nothing happened. So no paragraph actually turned red. So again, the misconception is that this selector here should have selected the first P element inside of the article. And so this would be this one, right? So as we just saw before, this paragraph is in fact the first paragraph inside of the article. However, this is not how the first child pseudo class actually works. Instead, what CSS will do is to select a P element that is actually the first child of the article. All right. So the P element is the first P element inside of the article, but it is not the first child of article. The first child of article is actually header, right? It is not a paragraph. And so therefore, this selector here does not work in the way that maybe we might think it would. So this would only work if a paragraph would actually be the first element of the article. So let's do that. So if we save now, then indeed we get some red paragraph. So now this paragraph is the first child of the article. And so therefore, now our selector applies. All right. Now let's see the end of our article. So it ends here. And we can see that a paragraph is actually the last child of the article element, right? And so what would work is this. So let's see our result. And indeed, now this text is red. And so it makes sense, right? Again, this worked because it is a p element inside of the article, and it is indeed the last child of that article. And so therefore, this selector then applied and did exactly what it should do. So basically what this means is that when we mix multiple elements inside of a parent element, then these pseudoclasses don't work really well. They are, however, perfect for situations like this one, where all the child elements are the same. So in a list like UL or OL, all the child elements are supposed to be LI, and so then this pseudoclass like first child, last child, or nth child work perfectly. Alright, and this is how you work with these pseudoclasses. Now, the pseudoclasses that we just learned about are all about matching the existing HTML structure. However, there are also other types of pseudoclasses, and so let's use some of them in the next video to finally style our hyperlinks. Alright, in this lecture we will learn how to style hyperlinks using pseudoclasses. But let's start by quickly fixing this red text here that we don't want. And actually what I will do here is to put this back to first child, which remember doesn't work, and then I will place a comment here using command or control slash, and then I will simply write that this is that misconception that we talked about in the last video. So this won't work. Okay, and so with this we are starting to document our code just a little bit. And so now I will actually add another comment here to say that here we will now be styling links or hyperlinks. Now we could think that this is how we style links. So we just write the A, so selecting all the anchor elements on the page, and then we could, for example, style their color. And let's say that we wanted to go with this same blue color here. And then as we reload it, actually these links look already nice. So this one turned blue, and these ones down here, and probably also these ones. Yeah, right. However, doing simply this is actually not a good practice. So we shouldn't simply select the anchor and then style it. Instead, we should style a pseudo class of the anchor, because that will then allow us to target different states. So the first one that we want to style is the link pseudo class. So this will basically target all the anchor elements that have an href attribute. Because remember that we can actually specify anchors, so A elements, without the href attribute. And so they would then be targeted with the code that we had before, even though they are not really a link. But with this, so by specifying the link pseudo class, this will then only target actual links. So if we reload, it still looks nice. Let me actually show that to you very quickly. So here, if we had the color of red, and if I then specified an A element somewhere here, a test A, so that's somewhere here. And so you see that this one is now actually red. And so that's coming from this style here, but not from this. And again, that's because this one only targets A element that do actually have an href attribute, which this one does not. So let's get rid of it, and also of this rule here. And yeah, so now you know that this is how it should be done. Let's actually keep looking at these links here. Now, another thing that's common to do when we style links is to get rid of the underline. So here is another CSS property to style text, which is text decoration, which we can set in this case to none. But there are a bunch of other values that I will show you in a second. But for now, we just want to get rid of the underline. And so in these situations, it's very common in multiple CSS properties to use the value of none. And indeed, now it's gone. And the same, of course, down here. Great. Next up, we have the visited pseudo class. So many sites actually display links differently if they have been clicked before. And one good example of that is Google. And in CSS, that would be really easy to do. All we had to do was to select the anchors with the visited pseudo class. So here we could then give them a different color, let's say like a light gray, something like this. Okay, but in practice, we never do that actually. So on normal pages, usually we always just give the visited links the same color as on the link pseudo class. So let's just do that and call it a day. And these two rules are actually now very similar. And so usually we actually group them together. But now let's not do that and keep everything just nicely separated, just for the purpose of learning here. Anyway, let's now go to our next pseudo class for anchors, which is the most important one, I would say, and that is hover. So in the hover pseudo class, we can define any styles that we want to be applied to the anchor as soon as the element is hovered by the mouse. So for example, let's say that in this situation, we wanted to change the color to something like orange red, which is one of these color names that I actually like a little bit. And then let's say that we also wanted to change the font weight to bold. So kind of a bit of a crazy style here. And let's actually also bring back the underline. So text decoration. And this one is another one of these shorthand properties where we can define multiple values. So in this case, we can define the text decoration line, text decoration style, and text decoration color. We can say underline. Then we can define the style of the underline, which is very similar to the style of the border. So let's say dotted, for example. And then finally the color. So let's set it also to orange red. And let's see what now happens as we hover this link. And it worked. So the color changed, the font weight also changed, and also the text decoration. Let's try another one, like wavy, which is also fun. And that looks like this. So again, a little bit of a crazy style. And if we want it to be a bit less crazy, we can actually omit the second one, and CSS will then automatically figure out that the second one here is now the color. And so this looks a little bit more normal, right? And so let's keep it like this. Finally, we can also specify a fourth pseudo class. And this one is the active pseudo class. And this is the state in which we are actually clicking. So when we do actually click on a link, then the active pseudo class is added to the element, and we can then select that here like this. So just like we did with all these other four link states. So let's keep adding some crazy styles here, like setting the background color to black in those situations. And let's even make the font style italic. Okay, so that's it. And so the hover state looks the same, but now I'm going to click. And so this is what it looks like during the duration of the click. Now, if I move out here and let it go, then it goes back to the normal state. All right, and I think that's actually it. What matters here is that these 4 states are always defined in this exact order. So always link, visited, hover, and active. So that is, if it's easier to memorize for you, 𝗬𝗓𝗖. All right, but of course we will keep doing this a couple more times throughout the rest of the course, and then things will become even easier for you. And now, with this, we actually reached the end of the very basics of some simple visual styling with CSS. Now, there is, of course, a lot of other visual stuff, like border radius, shadows, gradients, background images, and more, but we will leave that for a bit later. But for now, we will leave it at this point. And this is already great progress. So congratulations for making it this far and for already having learned all of this CSS. Next up, we will learn something about the browser, so a very helpful tool, and then we will of course keep learning CSS fundamentals by learning some theory and then learn some more properties that are related to some other stuff. So every modern browser contains a set of tools which makes our lives as developers a lot easier. And we call these tools collectively developer tools, or for short, dev tools. And so in this lecture, let's learn how to use the Google Chrome dev tools. And let's give ourselves some more space here to start. And now there are 3 ways to open up the developer tools. So first, you can right-click anywhere on the page and then click Inspect or Inspect Element. So these are the dev tools, but let me first show you 2 other ways. The second way is to come here to the View menu, then Developer, and then here Developer Tools. All right. Or the third way is a shortcut on the keyboard, and that is Option Command or Option Control on Windows I. All right. And then we will want to come here to the very first tab, which says Elements. Just make this a bit bigger so you can actually see it. All right. So the first thing that we can see here in the Elements tab is the exact HTML that we wrote in our HTML document, right? So here we can open up each element by clicking on them, and then as we hover them, they actually get highlighted here on the page, which can be very helpful. So you see, for example, that our header is this entire box that we see highlighted here in blue, right? So that's this. Then the navigation is all this. And if we open it, then each of these links is just this very small box here. And they are sitting here side by side, as we can see, right? So that is the first thing that we can explore here. And then the second thing, and even more important, is the Style tab here on the left side. So here we can see all the styles that have been applied to a certain element. So let's go to the H1, for example, here. And then we can click it. And then here on the left side, all the styles that are currently applied to this element in our CSS file are displayed here. So we have this rule somewhere in our code, which sets the font to 26 and does all of this, right? Then we also have this rule somewhere which sets the color. And in fact, it is this one here, right? So this first one is this. Then here we get this one. And finally, there's also this one here, right? And so that is exactly this one. Okay. Now, maybe you had wondered before why the text here is actually bold in this H1 element. And the reason for that is basically the default style. So those default styles for the H1 are what are displayed here in this rule of the user agent style sheet. So that's just a fancy word for basically the default style. And down here, we can see that the font weight is set to bold by default. Okay, then this one here is something that we will learn about very soon. So don't worry about it for now. And then here, let's see, for example, these links. And so here is the code for them. So the CSS that we had applied to them already. So the color and the text decoration, right? But now what if we actually wanted to add some more styles here? So we could actually do that. So just for testing purposes, of course, we could now add a font size, let's say, of 30 pixels. And then immediately all the links on the page, so not just this one, but also this one and the other ones, all of them will now have the font size of 30 pixels. And to test that, we can then turn it on and off. And of course, we can also turn the other styles on and off simply by clicking here. All right. And of course, these values that we specify here, they will not affect the final website. So our code does not get changed if we do this. And we can prove that by very easily reload the page, and then everything is back to normal. All right. But let's actually explore links a little bit more, because there's something cool that we can do. So right now, there is only this CSS rule here applied. So only the one that has the link pseudo class. And that's because right now, the link is not being hovered or it's not active. And so therefore, the style for that does not apply. However, by clicking here, we can basically fake one of these states. So we can, for example, fake that the link is currently being hovered. So if we click here on hover, then you see that now this rule here is applying, because now A with the pseudo class hover does actually exist. So let's see that on the page, and the one that should have this state is the one that I actually have selected here. So this is the one that I selected, and so this is the one that now looks as if it is being hovered, even though it is not. And so this is great, so we can test our web page without actually having to manually go there and hover over the links. Okay, of course, we can do the same for this one here. And we could go ahead and search that here in the HTML tree, but I find it easier to simply right-click on the element that I want and then inspect. And so that then automatically moves there. So if I click on hover now, then it automatically becomes hover, even though it's not really. And the same, of course, for active. Right? So it's active, but we also want it to look like it's hovered at the same time, because usually when it's active, it is also hovered. But anyway, what matters is that now we have all these rules here applying in this moment. All right. But now let's turn it off again. And yeah, I think that's actually all I had to show you at this point. So we're going to use the dev tools all the time throughout the rest of the course, because these are absolutely essential to create a website in an efficient way. So I was actually really excited when I found out myself about these tools, and I hope you like them as well, and that you maybe go ahead and experiment around a little bit with this now. So you can just click on any element that you'd like and experiment maybe a little bit with turning these styles on and off, maybe adding some other ones, and really analyzing a bit what happens here with all these different rules being applied. So have some fun with that, and I see you soon in the next video. Welcome back. Now, as we keep progressing through the CSS fundamentals section, there are a couple of fundamental and really important theoretical concepts that you really need to understand in order to eventually master CSS. Therefore, this section contains 5 theory lectures, and this one is the first one, and it's all about what happens when there are multiple CSS rules that apply to the same elements. So as we have written our code until this point, we have created a couple of situations in which multiple CSS selectors, and therefore multiple CSS rules, apply to the exact same element. And I call that conflicting selectors. And so let's now learn what happens in situations like that. So here is an example that is similar to the code that we wrote in our project. So it's the author paragraph that we have somewhere in the code. But here we have one ID called author text and one class called author. And then on the right side, we have three rules that are actually applied to this element. So as we can clearly see, all of these three different selectors, and therefore all of these three rules, all select the same element. And so now the big question is, which of these rules applies? Well, the answer to that is actually that all of them apply. So all rules and all the properties that are in the rules are applied to this element. However, if we take a close look, we can see that there are conflicting font size declarations, right? So in the first one, it says the font size should be 18, then 20 pixels, and then 22 pixels. So which of those is it going to be? Will it be 18, 20, or 22 pixels? Well, let's learn what rules CSS applies in order to resolve conflicting declarations like this one. So when there are multiple declarations for the exact same element, such as we have here in our example, then what matters are the selectors. So the highest priority for now are the ID selectors. So that means if there is any ID selector, then that is the rule that is going to be applied. Now, if there are multiple ID selectors, then it is the last of those selectors that gets applied. Now, in reality, it is actually a bit more complicated than this. So there are a lot of concepts involved, such as the cascade and selector specificity, but you don't need to know about these details for now as a beginner. So I think that the amount of information that I will give you in this slide should be enough for you to resolve your own conflicts in your own CSS code. All right, but anyway, in case there is no ID selector, then the next in the priority is a class or a pseudo class selector. And again, if there are multiple of one of those, then it is the last selector of those in the code that gets applied. Then the next is the element selector. So in case there is no ID selector or no class selector, then it is the element selector that gets applied. And again, if there are multiple, it is the last one of those. Finally, there's also something called the universal selector, but a bit more about that in the next lecture. What matters is that the universal selector is the one with the lowest priority of all. All right. But now, going back to our example and taking into consideration the rules that we have here, we should now be able to resolve the conflict that we have here. So we have a class selector, then we have an ID selector, and then we have an element selector, right? So based on the rules that we just learned here, it is the ID selector with the ID of author text that will decide the font size of this element. So for the conflicting font size property, it is this ID selector that actually gets applied. But keep in mind that the font style, font family, and the color from all the other selectors still applies, right? So that's what I mentioned in the last slide. So if we have multiple rules, so multiple selectors that select the same element, then all of those rules apply. So these rules here are only for resolving the conflicting properties, such as the font size in this case, because again, the font size is present in all the three rules that are applying right now to our author element. All right, And these are the most important rules that you need to know to resolve conflicting declarations. But just for the sake of completeness, there are actually things that have a higher priority than the ID selector. So one of those things is inline styles. So remember that we declare inline styles by using the style attribute in HTML. Now, since we shouldn't actually do this anyway, this is not really important. But you should still know that these styles actually have priority over the styles that are declared using an ID selector. Then, with the highest priority, we have declarations marked with the important keyword. And the important keyword is basically just a hack that you can use as a last resort to resolve conflicts in your CSS. But this should usually not be used. So, as I mentioned, it should only be as a last resort. But what matters is that this really is the highest priority that can exist. Whenever we mark a declaration with important, it is the one that will be applied. Okay, and with all that being said, let's now jump back into our code and actually see this in practice. And let's create a very simple example with this paragraph that is in the footer. So right now here we have added the ID of copyright, but let's now also add a class to it. So just to create a kind of similar example to what we had in the slide. So here I'm adding a class of copyright. So a class can have the exact same name as the ID. That's not a problem at all. And now I will do something that we actually didn't do before, which is to add another class. So we can actually add multiple classes, and all we have to do is to just add a space. So I will also add the class of text. And so now this one has both the class of copyright and of text. All right. So we will be able to select the element using both of them. So let's try to do that here at the end. I will just add another comment here, resolving conflicts. So let's try to add some different colors to this text. So here I'm going to say copyright and set it to red. Then copyright the class, set it here to blue. Then the class of text, set it to yellow here. And finally, I'm also going to select it using elements. So I will use the descendant selector here, footer, and then P. So I will simply select the P element that's inside of the footer. But keep in mind that these are still elements. And so here I will apply the green color. So right now we have these 4 rules, and so these 4 selectors that are applying to that element. So which color do you think the text will have? Well, let's see. And indeed, it is red. And so that's because we have an ID selector here. And the ID selector has a higher priority than, for example, this one here, or this one, or this one, because these are class selectors and these are element selectors. Actually, VS Code helps us resolving this conflict, by the way. So if we hover over this, we have this hint which says selector specificity. And so there we have a 1 in the very first position. And here in the class, we have a 1 in the second position. And here in the element, we have a 2, but that doesn't matter. So it's just a number in the third position. And so the first position is the one that has the highest priority. The second has the second highest priority, and then the elements. Okay. Now, again, there are some more rules here. For example, the reason behind why there is a 2, but let's not focus on that for now. All right. What matters is that this is an ID, and therefore it is the red color that applies now. We can also see that here in the inspector, so in the DevTools. So if I inspect this element here, then you see that we need some more space here. But what you also see is that we have this copyright here. So that's this one. We also have this other one which comes from before for the font size. And so here now both of them apply. And then we also have these other three. So these three rules are also here. And you see that all of them here are basically crossed out, right? So they have this strike through, which means that they are not being applied. Okay. Now, what happened if this one here did not exist? So if we turned this one here off, basically, so that would be the same as deleting this code. And so what do you think would happen then? So in that case, we have two class selectors and one element selector. So try to make your guess, and then let's try to either remove this code or to uncheck this box. And yeah, the text turned yellow. And the reason for that is that now we have these two selectors with the same hierarchy, so with the same priority, and then in that situation, it is the last one that applies. And so that is this one. Right? Now if we turn that one off, then of course it would be blue. And finally, only then, if none of these three existed, then the text would become green. So I hope that made sense. And let's actually analyze some more situations here. So for example, this element here, I think it has a class, or actually an ID. So yeah, it has an author ID, and of course it also has this element selector which applies to all the paragraphs. And so here we have the conflicting font size, and yeah, basically that's the example that we studied in the slide, right? So this one here is pretty obvious. Then let's check out this H1 here, because here we have a lot of rules that are applying. But in fact, they don't seem to be conflicting, or actually they are conflicting. So here the color is supposed to be this gray, and then here it is supposed to be this blue. So let's go up where this actually happens. And so, yeah, it is these three rules here that are applying, right? But all of them are only element selectors. So there's no IDs and no classes. And so therefore, the reason why the color is actually blue and not gray is because this selector here appears last in the code. If we put this one first, then you would see that the text would indeed become gray. Okay, but let's put that back. Okay, and now just one final example with the links. So let's move down here. And remember also how we said in the slide, how these pseudo-classes actually also have priority over elements. And so even if we put like this here, so if we selected the anchors simply by doing this without any pseudo-class, let's say color red once again, then the reason why this does not have any effect on the links is because this one has a higher priority because it does have the pseudo class in the selector, and this one does not, right? And so if we now select this here, then you will see that both of these rules do apply, but the color, as I just mentioned, will of course come from this one. And again, that's because this one here does have the pseudo class, while this one is very simply a element selector. Okay, and yeah, this is what you need to know for now. We will encounter some of these situations later on as we go through the course, and by then I will explain a little bit more about this. But for now, this is all I wanted you to know about this topic, which can be quite confusing for beginners when they start writing their own CSS code. and then the rules start conflicting, and then they do not really understand what is happening. So I think that this is important, and so hopefully you liked this video and found it useful. Oh, and just one final thing that I actually wanted to show you before I leave you with this is the important keyword. So remember how the important keyword makes a declaration more important, basically, than all the other ones. So let's come back down here, inspect it, and of course, as we already saw, this selector here, so this one, is the one with the lowest priority of all because it's just an element selector. But if we now add the important keyword here like this, so exclamation mark important, then all of a sudden the text will become green, right? So just as you can see it here. But again, this is more of a hack that you should not be using usually. Just in case you really cannot figure out what's happening in your code. But even then, instead of using the important keyword, what you should probably do is to write simpler selectors. So this is also an important rule and an important takeaway that you should take from this lecture. So always write your selectors as simple as possible and do not add too much nesting, or don't add too many IDs and classes all in the same selector. Okay, so I will leave that here for you, but I will comment it out so that it does not apply. And actually, we don't need any of this. Let me put it back on, and I will comment all of this. Okay, and with this, I will leave you and will then see you in the next video. There is an extremely powerful mechanism in CSS called inheritance. And so let's now learn all about inheritance. And actually, we already saw inheritance in action before. So remember back at the beginning of this section, I mentioned that, for example, this element here, so this Laura Jones, which is a strong element, still gets the styles of the paragraph element inside of which it is located, right? So let's inspect this element here. And so, of course, it is a strong element. And so as a default style, and so that's the user agent style sheet, remember. So as a default, it gets the font weight of bold, right? But then here we see that also it gets inherited from the paragraph. So from its parent element. So here it gets the italic, the 18 pixels of a font size, and also the line height of 1.5. And so basically what this means is that inheritance is a mechanism by which some styles, so some properties, get their values inherited from parent elements to child elements. And so let's now use this in a big way by setting some styles onto the body element. So we use the body elements to set some styles because the body element is the parent element of all the other elements in our HTML document. And so if we set certain properties in the body, then their values will get inherited to all of their child elements. Now, not all properties do actually get inherited. It is mostly the ones that are about text. So let's start with a very simple one. So the color, and let's set the color to red. Now, what do you think is going to happen in this situation, given that we actually set the color on most of these elements here already down here? Well, let's see. And so as we reload, nothing really changed here. And the reason for that is that while this red color still got inherited, this color property right here in this rule did override the inherited style. Okay? So the inherited styles are easily overwritten whenever there is any rule that applies for the same property. So an inherited property is very easily overwritten by any rule which has a value for that same property. So in a sense, we can say that inherited values are the ones who have the lowest priority. But anyway, if we now removed the color from here, and let's just comment it out, then, well, all the text which does not have a color declared will become red. So this one here, all of this. Now this one is still blue because we're overriding it here, right? But then everything else is red. And so now what we can do is to set the text color that we're actually interested in here in the body. And so now all the text is gray, such as before, but all we have to do is to declare that value in the body, and then this value 444 gets inherited for the color for all of the rules which do not have a color declaration. And now let's actually do the same with the font family. So I will actually cut it from here and paste it here. The same for this one. And so once again, all the elements got the sans serif value here inherited for the font family property. All right. And actually, if we go back here one step, so I'm just putting it back. So you see that here the links, they are actually still in the serif style, because nowhere in our code we added the font family of sans serif to them, right? So now I'm doing it again here, pasting it here, and take a look what happens now. And you see now they are just like the rest of the text in sans serif. And so actually we no longer need this selector here. We can just get rid of it. And just to be sure, I really want to clarify something here one more time. So this is really elements inheriting values for certain properties from one another. So this is not conflicting selectors. Or in other words, this body selector here is not selecting all of these elements. Okay? It does not apply to all the elements. Instead, what we do is to declare values for these properties here, such as color and font family, and then they simply get passed down to all the child elements that are contained within the body. And so that's why we use the technique of putting these properties that are related to text into the body. Okay? Because these are the ones that we then want all of the elements on the page to have. Now, as I said before, many styles do actually not get inherited, because that would be very impractical for most of the properties. For example, let's say border top. So if we declare a border top of 10 pixels and solid with our blue color to the body, let's see what happens then. And indeed, it simply added this blue border to the top of our body element. But it did not do so to all of the child elements, right? Because again, that would be very, very impractical. And now let's take a quick look at a graphical representation of inheritance to really make it crystal clear. So here we have a very simple example of a web page which simply contains a navigation, an H1, and a P element. And on the right side, we also have some styles for the body element, and in particular, the color, font size, font family, and border top. Now, of course, the body element here is the parent element of all these other three elements. And so, therefore, thanks to inheritance, all of these three elements basically get access to these three properties that are inherited. And again, all these three properties are basically related to text, while on the other hand, the border property does not get inherited. So not all of the properties do get inherited, but it is mostly the ones related to text. And I have a big list of many of the properties that do get inherited, so you can take a look at them if you'd like. But anyway, let's now say that we also have a rule for the H1 element. And so it declares basically a new color and a new font size. So it's bigger and it is blue. And so what happens now is that these two declarations do actually override the inherited styles. Therefore, for the H1, the color is no longer gray and the font size is no longer 16 pixels, but instead it is now blue and 32 pixels. So this is a visual representation of inheritance in action, which I hope makes it a little bit more clear so that you can really understand how it works. So maybe take some more time looking at this and studying this example a little bit more, and then we will actually get one more time back to our code. And what I want to show you now is that inheritance actually also works on a much smaller scale, which is something that we also do all the time. So inheritance is not only helpful by putting styles into the body, but also in other situations. So let's say that we wanted to change the size of these 4 links here. That would actually be very easy. All we would have to do is to, let's go there. So would be to put a class on them and then select these links based on the class, right? Or we could also do something like this. So we could do nav and then select the A elements in there with the pseudo class of link, right? Let's say we wanted the font size to be 18 pixels. And so you see that that actually worked. But now let's say that we, for some reason, also had a paragraph in here saying this is the navigation. And so this is now probably 22 pixels big. Let's see. Yeah, because that's the default that we set for the paragraphs. But we also want this to be 18 pixels, just like everything here in our navigation. So how could we do that? Well, of course, we could add that here like this, and it would work again, right? But we could also do it in a much better way. So we don't need all of this. All we need to do is to say nav and then set the font size to 18 pixels in here, and then all of the rest should inherit those styles. Now, actually the paragraph here does not inherit it because we specifically set a font size of 22 for the paragraphs already. So that might not be such a good example. Let's use a strong element here. Okay, and so now this should be 18 pixels just as specified here. So if we took this back, then let's see what we got there. All right, so nothing really. But now if this was here turned on, so if we set the font size in the navigation to 18 pixels, then now we could see that the strong element here got the 18 pixels inherited from nav. Okay, and so now everything here is 18 pixels, and that's thanks to inheritance. Okay, so this is a technique that we use all the time, but let's now actually get rid of the strong here. And again, I can actually comment out this code just like we did in CSS before by hitting Command or Control/. All right. And now just to finish, there is actually another way of adding some styles to all of the elements. So let's go back up here actually, and I will put it here. And what I'm talking about is the universal selector that I mentioned in the slide about conflicting selectors. So basically, the universal selector simply selects every single element on the page. And so this is useful if we actually want a certain property applied to all elements, but which does not get inherited. So, for example, the color we want on all the elements, but the color gets inherited. And so we can simply put it here in the body, right? However, now imagine that we wanted the border top on all the elements. So this, for example, we could paste this here, and as we reload, we would get this beautiful result. So you see every single element, and that includes like the EM here and the strong. So all of them now have this border top, right? So not really helpful, but it helps demonstrate that we really can apply a certain style to every single element on the page. Just keep in mind that this selector is actually the one with the lowest priority. So it would be very easy to simply override this. Okay, let's say that here we had red on the body, and then this one would be red, and only all the other ones would be blue. And again, because this is an element selector, and so it has a higher priority than the universal selector. But let's put it back, and actually let's turn this one off right here. So the universal selector is actually quite important. For now, we don't have a big use case for it yet, but we will soon, and then I will explain it a little bit more. But for now, what I want you to understand is that there is a big difference between the universal selector and the body selector. So the universal selector simply applies to all the elements, and there is no inheritance involved. And therefore, this is perfect if you want to apply a certain property that does not automatically get inherited to all the elements. On the other hand, any style that we put here in the body gets inherited. And so that's simply a completely different mechanism than using the universal selector.